Hey, Michelle and Nancy, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay. Great.
um, I want to say thank you to everyone who's here today. I'm just going to go over a few things before we get started with everyone else. First of all, thank you again for joining us in this new platform, and we're really looking forward to your participation today. So there are two areas actually for you to participate in. There is, let's see, chat at the bottom of the screen. You'll see chat and Q&A. So you can use the chat function to write in your comments or things that you want your fellow attendees to see. Or you can use Q&A when you have questions. And we're going to do our best to answer those questions towards the last 20 minutes of the meeting. So when you open Q&A, what you'll see is a little box that's on the right. You would type your question, press send, and the panelists and myself will see that and we'll be able to answer your questions. I also want to advertise our next upcoming author talk, which is actually a children's author, Nathan Hale. He's written several Eisner-nominated graphic novels for children, and it's a free online event, and it's recommended for children grades 3 through 7, and that's on December 14th. And you can register for that one at bit.ly/Nathan Hale High, and we'll also have that on the librarieshawaii.org website. So I'm going to hand it over to our presenters today.
Hey. Hello, everyone. Okay, so normally, Nancy, in Hawaii, we usually will present our speaker with a fresh flower lei, but unfortunately, too far to do that. But instead, I'm going to, I've been sewing cloth masks for people, and I bought library theme fabric. So if you're interested, I would be happy to send you one.
Oh, I would love that. Yes, I'd love that.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle, and I'm a librarian with the Hawaii State Public Library System. Mahalo for joining us today for an author talk with our special guest, Nancy Pearl. Besides being one of the greatest of all time librarians, she co-authored a new book with Jeff Schwager called The Writer's Library, The Authors You Love on the Books That Changed Their Lives, which was published in September. So many library workers are familiar with Nancy's work as a reading advocate and a popular speaker at library conferences. And for those meeting her for the first time, here are some highlights of her work. Nancy is a regular book commentator for the NPR's Morning Edition show. She also hosts a TV show called Bookless with Nancy Pearl on the Seattle channel. Nancy has received many honors for her work, including the 2011 Librarian of the Year Award from Library Journal. Nancy also used to teach classes about the art of matching readers with good books for the University of Washington's Master in Library and Information Science program. Which is where I got to meet her. And Nancy's Bookless classes were two of the most fun and useful that I took there, and I still apply what I learned every day. The number one thing was, it's not about you, it's about the reader. Fun fact, Nancy inspired a library action figure, which I have right here. It comes with shushing action, but unfortunately my button broke, so it's permanently shushing. Besides her work as a librarian and literary critic, Nancy is a best-selling author. HSPLS owns all of her books, including Booklist, George and Lizzie, and Segue Alert, The Writer's Library. So readers, as Daniel said, feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll, Nancy and I will talk story for the first part, and then we'll get to your questions in the second part. Okay, so here we go, questions. Okay. So please tell us more about the Writer's Library and the process of creating it. What inspired you to take on this project with Jeff?
So actually, this was Jeff Schwager's idea, and he and I met when he interviewed me for a project that he was doing for the Washington State Jewish Historical Society. They were honoring 20 Jewish women throughout Washington State, and I was one of the women who was honored, and it was an honor. And Jeff interviewed all of the women. So when Jeff and I started talking during that interview, we quickly discovered that we both were big readers, and that we agreed about we agreed on many of the writers. that we started talking about. But of course, there were writers that he liked and I wasn't so fond of, or that I loved and he wasn't so fond of. But one day Jeff said, we started sort of hanging out and talking about books. He's like a little brother to me.
Mhm.
And he said, well, what if we did this coffee table book and we went to these writers' houses and took pictures of their home libraries? Wouldn't that be fun to do? And we could do little interviews with each of the writers, but it would be a lot of pictures. And I said, well, that doesn't sound really good to me. I'm not really into coffee table, not into coffee table books. I said, but interviewing writers for a book, I think that would be really, really fun.
Mhm.
And so we got in touch with my agent, Victoria Sanders in New York, and she thought, no coffee table books. She said, that's not your brand, Nancy. Forget that. She said, but a book of interviewing writers would be really, I think that she could sell that.
Mhm.
And so Jeff and I then started to decide what authors we would want to interview, and he made a list and I made a list, and the authors that we both had on our lists were the first on the list that we tried to get. And then gradually we worked out a list of what I think is a really wonderfully diverse list of American writers. But it's
Mhm.
an America that's writ large. It's a very inclusive America. Several of the writers that we interview came to America and became Americans as children from Viet Thanh Nguyen from Vietnam, and Maza Mengistu from Ethiopia, Leila Lalami from Morocco. Uh, One of my favorite people to interview was Luis Alberto
Mhm.
Urrea, who is just, I mean, you have to have him on, Michelle. You have to find a way to interview him because he is just wonderful. Well, they were all wonderful to talk to, all the writers. So the book ended up with 22 interviews of 23 writers. And the reason there's that discrepancy is that we interviewed Michael Chabon and his wife Ayala Waldman, both of whom are writers. We interviewed them together
Mhm.
at their home in Berkeley, sitting around their dining room table while they were eating peanut butter and banana sandwiches, which they offered to me and Jeff, but we had already eaten, so we just drank tea. So most of the interviews, the majority of the interviews were done at the authors' homes. When that didn't work out for one reason or another, we did it at a place that was meaningful to the writers.
I'm curious, were the authors pretty open to meeting in their homes usually, or were they kind of like hesitant?
I know, it's so interesting, Michelle, because I thought many of the people would say no. I'll we'll meet at the library, or we'll meet at some a bookstore or something. But most of the writers said, yeah,
Mm.
come to my home. Amor Towles, Jennifer Egan, Michael Chabon, as I said, Ayala Waldman, Andrew Sean Greer, whose book Less won the Pulitzer Prize in 2017, and Richard Ford in Maine. All of those people said, sure,
Oh, nice.
so it was very nice. And, when we talked about the writer's library, we didn't just mean the books that were on their bookshelves. We meant the kind of library that was in their heart,
Mhm.
the books that had meant the most to them. So it was very interesting, as you can imagine.
Um, oh, forgot. I was going to say, so you talked about how you selected the authors to interview, and I could tell that you were very intentional about selecting a diversity of authors, like not just ethnicity, but gender, location, genre.
Right.
What were there other qualities that you looked for in the authors that you chose to interview?
Really the most important thing for us was that we loved the author's writing, and
Mhm.
that we really wanted to talk to the writer about what what books they loved and what books sort of made them the kind of writer that they were.
Mhm.
One of the most interesting interviews, I think, and each interview I feel like is interesting in its own way. It's because when we were doing the interviews, we didn't have a set list of questions. So we didn't ask each writer the same questions. Really, what these are, I think, almost rather than interviews, we could call these conversations.
Mhm.
Usually we would start out, I would say, were you a reader as a child, or did you come from a reading family? And that would kick off the discussion. But then we just let the discussion go wherever the writer took it.
Mhm.
So each author's interview is very different from the one before and the
Mhm.
one after. Um,
I noticed too, like when you at the end of each interview, like almost everyone has kind of a striking ending that kind of captures the flavor of the subject. How did you know when to end the interview then, and then how did you edit them?
Oh, good questions. Those are both good questions. So Jeff and I taped the interviews on our iPhones. We both did, so we would have a backup just in case one failed. And when we first started out, and the first author that we interviewed was Charles Johnson, the National Book Award winning author of Middle Passage, who's gone on to do a lot of writing, fiction and nonfiction, short stories, essays. Um, when we started out by doing the transcription from the audio interviews to put it down on paper, and that just drove me absolutely insane. I mean, I couldn't do it. Was so hard to do for me. And really, if we had left it up to me, we wouldn't have had, there wouldn't be a book, because I could not do those. I couldn't do that transcription. But then I was talking to a Seattle writer, another Seattle writer, and she said, oh, I think my son's girlfriend, who works at a bookstore in Seattle, would really be happy to do the transcriptions. I'm sure she wouldn't charge you a lot of money. So thank goodness Annika Miller took over doing those transcriptions. So then we started working with the paper copies. But I should say that after about an hour or an hour and a half of talking to these authors, Jeff would have happily gone on to keep talking, but I would kick him and say, all right, we need to stop, because, we don't want to take up all this time. These authors are being so generous. So we would end up with a big interview, 10,000 words, 15,000 words, a lot. And then we would have to cut them down. And Jeff and I would take turns. I would do the first cuts, the first draft of an interview, and then he would, look at it, do a second draft, and vice versa for the other interviews. And so when we had cut the interviews down, what we would do then is we sent them back to the authors, so the authors could go over the interviews and make sure that what they wanted to say is what was coming out in the
That's
interview.
really nice.
Well, it wasn't like a news story
Yeah.
where you wouldn't go back, you wouldn't go back to the people that you were interviewing. But this was really, as I said, it was a conversation, and we really wanted the writers to be happy with what came out.
So you mentioned that you didn't go in with a list of questions, just had the starter one, but was there any other way that you prepared for the author interviews?
Yeah, the way that we prepared was reading the author's books, or in some cases that meant rereading the author's books. And because so many of the authors were real favorites of either Jeff's or mine,
Mhm.
that was a pretty easy way to prepare. And,
Mhm.
I do this TV show where I interview writers. I mean, I've done it for since 2004. Um, and I've always found that it makes for better interviews if you just let the conversation flow.
Mhm.
But I always have questions in my head,
Mhm.
that I've thought about. Um, and I think if a writer's worth interviewing, as all of these writers were, that that carrying on a conversation with them would be a real pleasure.
Mhm.
And that's what it was for sure.
Um, I noticed like that some of the interviews, well, they all have like a friendly tone pretty much, but
Yeah,
some of them are especially like kind of intimate. It's like a little party.
yeah.
And did that come from, were you building on existing relationships with the authors, or was it from your experience interviewing that you felt so comfortable? Or
I think, okay, so many of the writers, either I or Jeff had interviewed in the past.
oh, okay.
But we didn't have um, any relationship with them
Mhm.
necessarily.
Mhm.
Um, Russell Banks, for example, who told us these wonderful stories about his reading as a child and his beginnings as a writer. Um, he was the first author. His book, The Sweet Hereafter, was the book that we chose in Seattle in 1998 for the very first Seattle Reads,
Mhm.
the community reading program. So when I wrote him to see if he would agree to be interviewed, I would start out by saying, I don't know if you remember me, but, and then, he was thrilled about that. And with T.C. Boyle, which I think is one of the interviews that sounds the most intimate, maybe friendly with me and Jeff. I think that's just the kind of person that he is.
Oh.
When we wrote to him, he said, absolutely, what fun we will have.
Oh.
And we
Oh.
did have just a wonderful time at his home. And his home is in Montecito, California, right near Santa Barbara, where Oprah lives, and Meghan and Prince Harry also live there.
Mm.
But he lives in a Frank Lloyd Wright prairie style home, the first prairie style home of Frank Lloyd Wright's that was built west of the Mississippi. And he took us all around it. And I mean, it's an amazing house. And, he had a little picnic for us. And
Oh.
I mean, it was just, and he just is such a wonderful reader. And his was one of the houses where we looked at his bookshelves and we
Mm.
would talk about the books, and seeing a book that you love on a writer on the bookshelves of a writer that you admire. I mean,
Mm.
it was so wonderful. I mean, I've interviewed some writers, Michelle, that I've ended up the end of the interviews pretty much convinced that I could never read another one of their books because,
Oh.
there was just something that turned me off.
Mhm.
And that's always I mean, that's an issue I think that interviewers face
Mhm.
when they're choosing somebody to interview. But every writer in the writer's library, those interviews were so much fun and
Mhm.
um, so interesting that I would happily read any books that these writers wrote. And I'm looking forward to their new books when they come out.
Um, oh, speaking of when you were, you got to see people's bookshelves, was there anything that surprised you or stuck out?
Well, one of the things that surprised us in the interviews in general
Mhm.
is how many of the writers talked about how important reading science fiction and fantasy was to
Mm.
them when they were tweens, young teens, for example, and how many of them, 4 or 5 out of the 23, which is a huge percentage, I think, talked about how the Richard Adams Watership Down book,
Oh,
that
yeah.
book was so important to them, and how much they loved it. Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman have 4 kids who are now all teenagers and above. And Michael read to all of those kids every night. And one of the books that he read to, as I understand it, all 4 of them was Watership Down. But maybe my favorite Watership Down story was Madeline Miller. Madeline Miller's the author of Circe and the Song of Achilles, retellings of Homer's tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And she talked about how when she read Watership Down, she just couldn't put it down. I mean, she just couldn't stop reading it. And the last 100 pages, she said, are all that every single novel should be. The last 100 pages were so powerful to her. And she read the book as though it were like a heroic tale. I mean, you could see, which it is, but you could see where her interest in the classics was kind of bolstered by that. And then we looked on her bookshelf. We were sitting in her living room and we looked at the bookshelf, and I said, "Oh, there's a copy of Watership Down on your bookshelf." She said, "Oh, that's not my comfort copy." She said, "That's the copy I lend to people." She said, "My comfort copy, the copy I had when I was 10 years old, is upstairs in my bedroom," she said. So that's the kind of insights that you don't get, or the kind of lovely insights into a writer's life that you don't get ordinarily in an interview. And I think that's what makes these interviews so much fun.
Yeah. The warmth kind of exudes from the pages in the interviews.
Thank you.
I saw that one was hard to get scheduled in person, so it was an email one. Was there a big difference you feel in that one?
Yes. And I think that readers can see that there was a big difference. So Jeff and I started out that we really did not want to do email interviews. We really wanted to interview the writers in person. And but one of the writers that we very much wanted to include in the book was Donna Tartt, because both Jeff and I loved her I loved her middle book the best. But The Secret History is the first one that was extremely popular. And we wanted to include Donna Tartt. And Donna Tartt agreed to be interviewed, but we could never get her in New York when we were in New York, or, we could just never be in the same city to do the interview in person. So we decided to do it over email. And I think there is a difference. I mean, I think it's still, reading it, you get you learn a lot about Donna Tartt, and she is a real reader as well. But it doesn't have that kind of closeness and warmth, I think, that the other interviews do have.
I was going to ask, going through the book at the end, you talk about books obviously throughout the conversations, and at the end you highlight a list of like some of the most important books to the author. So I was curious, for you as an author, since you wrote the novel George and Lizzie, what were the books that were most formative for you?
Oh yeah, that's a great question too. I love that question. So there was an author that I read when I was a teenager, whose books are, I'm very sad to say, are long out of print. And her name was Mary Stolz, Stolz. And she wrote both for teenagers and for middle grade kids. And one of her books, A Dog on Barkham Street, I think is the title, which she wrote for middle grade students, was a Newbery honor book. But her teenage novels really had this huge influence on me, the style of them, and they were very different from the other teenage books that were out at that time. And I would love to see them back in print. So she was one person who really had a big influence on me. as an adult, I think that Ann Tyler's novels, Ann Tyler's early novels, the novels she wrote in the 70s and 80s, maybe up through The Accidental Tourist, were books that just that I just cherished. I thought they were just brilliant.
Mhm.
And another writer whose books meant a lot to me is a writer named Ruth Doane McDougall, especially her novel called The Cheerleader. And, so I think that my novel, George and Lizzie, which was so much fun for me to write, is not like any of their books at all. But you can see, I think if you know those those authors and their books, you can see their influence. I mean, partly all of those writers write very character-driven books, and the writing is very, very character-driven books. Ann Tyler, for example, perhaps is one of the best writer of character-driven fiction, and George and Lizzie, as you could tell from the title, is really character-driven. But also Ann Tyler, especially, again, I mean, her writing is absolutely beautiful. She's a beautiful writer. They're so nicely written, all of her novels. And I think that George and Lizzie, I aspired to that as well, because those are the kind of books, those are the kind of novels I love. And I think when you're writing a novel, you write it for yourself. I wrote the kind of novel that I would want to read. And because there weren't any more Ann Tyler books that I didn't almost have by heart.
Was the Writer's Library also the kind of book that you wanted to read?
Not in the same way. I think it was more, I think it was more that I was just really interested. I'm really interested in how people choose what to read, what books are important to them, and what that says about who they are as human beings, as parents, as, whatever you want to, just how important reading is. And my belief that to be a good writer, you have to be a reader. And I think that's kind of borne out by what how the writers talked about the books that they read. And I know for me, when I was writing the novel George and Lizzie, I knew exactly what kind of novel it was going to be. I mean, because I knew the kind of novels that I liked, and I knew the kind of reader that I was writing it for, me. And so there was no question in my mind about how I would tell the story. I mean, if you read a lot, if you're a reader, I think you begin to understand what kind of a reader you are. And I've always been interested in people looking at their reading and understanding why it is there are certain books that they love, and why it is that there are books that they wish they had never picked up and began. So in that sense, the Writer's Library is that kind of a book.
Okay, I see it's almost 3:30, so
Okay.
I have one more question, and then I'll
Turn
leave
it
it
over.
to the audience. Yeah. So were there many more authors that you had hoped to include? And if so, are you thinking about a sequel?
There were authors that we wish that we could have included. Two authors that we really wanted very badly to include. One was Toni Morrison, who of course was sick at the time, very ill at the time that we were writing this. And then Alice Munro, the great Canadian short story writer, is again in her 80s and not doing interviews, we were told. We really wanted to include the Lori Moore, who is another fabulous short story writer, one of my all-time favorites. and she just wanted to do it via email. And that was at the very beginning of our project. And Jeff and I were a little snooty, I hate to say it, and we didn't want to do it via emails, but I really regret it. No, we didn't include Lori Moore. And then we wanted to include Tobias Wolff, who wrote This Boy's Life and other books, but This Boy's Life is one of the best memoirs ever written. And I highly, highly recommend it. And I am not a big memoir reader, so I'm not a huge fan of memoirs, but This Boy's Life is so wonderful. So those were some of the writers. I don't know if there'll be a sequel. I mean, it's hard to see that the world will get back to normal anytime soon, although we all hope so. So I don't know. I think it would be great to do one with children's authors. I've interviewed,
that would be fun.
I've interviewed some children's authors over the years, and boy, it would be fabulous. M.T. Anderson is somebody who I'd love to have talked to about the kind of books that he read as a kid and what they meant to him, and other major writers, major children's writers. I would have loved to do that, but Jeff is not interested in children's books at all. And I'm not sure that I can do this on my own.
Sounds like a really good partnership you have.
It was. We did a lot of travel back and forth across the country, but we did it, and we ended up still friends, which I think was our goal. One of my favorite stories, Michelle, I just have to tell the story, is when we interviewed Louise Erdrich. We interviewed her in her bookstore, Birch Bark Books, which is in right outside Minneapolis. And she told us this wonderful story, which we included in the interview, that when she read Animal Farm, she said to herself, "This is the best book about pigs I have ever read. This author knows pigs." And she said she was 8 years old when she read that. So she told us wonderful, wonderful stories about looking high on her parents' bookshelf, and there was a copy of Marjorie Morningstar that her parents, which is, I think, could be considered a little bit racy for a 9-year-old. But, Louise told us that she climbed on a chair to take it down because she wanted to read it. So, I love little insights into authors' lives that we got. It was really wonderful.
That's good. Okay, so here's the first question. Let's see. I think some of the people might not know about Nancy's role with the One Book, One City idea. Could you talk about that? I think it's an important model today in bringing our country together, reading diverse lit together with empathy.
Yeah. So in 1993, wait a second. Around 1998, the Center for the Book at the Seattle Public Library, which I was the executive director of, got a very nice grant from the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Foundation to develop programs to bring audiences to literature. And I have always been a big believer in book groups to bring people from diverse backgrounds, different ages, different ethnicities, different beliefs together to talk about ideas, to talk about books. And so Russell Banks, as I said, was the first author that we did in 1998. And the second author was Ernest Gaines. We read A Lesson Before Dying.
Oh, wow.
And then the third author was Bill Moyers, who had done a collection of poetry, an anthology of poetry. And I wanted to do poetry because I wanted to encourage people to read poetry. But I think that that these and the idea of a community read really took off from there, and really what people have done with it is so, I mean, it just boggles my mind, the brilliance that people have around the world to do these community reading programs. And I was fortunate enough to be in Bosnia about 7 years ago, and Bosnia is a really fractured country. So that after the war, really the people, really the Muslims are, educate their children separately. The Croats and the Serbs um, educate their children separately. There's really no way for kids to come together. And we did an All Bosnia's Kids Read project with
Oh, the whole country?
the State
Oh,
Department.
wow.
Yeah, the U.S. State Department. There's a wonderful, wonderful cultural attaché there named Sunshine Eisen, and she had this brilliant idea of bringing kids together who don't go to school together, who have a really, really difficult background of hatred because of the different ethnicities and because of the war, which was so horrible. So, but I mean, that's big. But even in the smallest community, there's differences in the way people think about the world and think about what's happening. And I always feel it's much easier to talk about important issues if you have a book that you can refer back to. And it's always been my my idea. I mean, I've always felt that really the best books are books that when you close the book, you have all these questions that you want to talk about. And Ernest Gaines' book, The Sweet Hereafter, Ernest Gaines' book, A Lesson Before Dying, and Russell Banks's book, The Sweet Hereafter, are both ideal for book discussions and bring up really, really important issues about what it means to be human.
Thank you. Next one is from Kristen Tarnas. As an elementary teacher, I am so excited about the idea of a sequel focusing on children's writers. I bet lots of people would want to partner with you. Happy face. What children's books have been important in your life?
I was a children's librarian, and I became a librarian because of the children's librarian at my local library in Detroit, Michigan, Miss Whitehead. And so there are so many children's books that were important to me. The Hobbit was really important to me. Going back to picture books, Make Way for Ducklings was important to me. But Miss Whitehead was the kind of librarian who really, when she met me, all I read were horse and dog books. And one day she said to me, I was about 9 then, and she said, "Nancy, I have a brand new book by Marguerite Henry, who wrote wonderful horse books, Misty of Chincoteague and Sea Star and Born to Trot," which is my favorite. And she said, "And you could be the first person in this library to read this book. What do you think? Would you like to?" Well, who would not want to be, if you're 9 years old, 10 years old, to be the first person in the library, a place where you basically have lived because you didn't want to be home? How could you say no? So I said, "Oh, yes, Miss Whitehead, yes." And I held out my hand for the book. And in the first example of bait and switch that I've ever been introduced to, Miss Whitehead said, "Oh, but wait a minute. Before I give you this book, I'd like you to read another book." And so she was Canadian, and she, raised me on British and Canadian, but there weren't very many Canadian authors writing, or that we got then, but we got all the British writers in the library. So, she gave me Mary Poppins. She's the one who gave me The Hobbit. I still have my copy of The Hobbit that she actually bought me and gave me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And oh gosh, The Children of Green Know, all of those books. The Edward Eager books, the ones that begin this, he only wrote 7 or 8. Half Magic is still one of my very, very favorite books. E. Nesbit, Five Children in It, all of those. The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet by Eleanor Cameron is another one that I loved. I could go on, but Miss Whitehead was a librarian who really believed that she believed that kids should be challenged in a way with their reading, and she had a display that the title of the display was Too Good to Miss. So she would put new books, she would put basically older titles there, but she wanted me to read all the Newbery books, all the Newbery Award books, beginning with the very first and going on. And of the Newbery Award books, I think my favorite one as a kid, and one of the reasons why I got a master's degree in history, was Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes, which is just a fabulous one. And then I loved Hitty, Her First 100 Years. I loved The Graveyard Book, but I read that as an adult, of course. So yeah, a lot of children's books. And I wrote this whole book, Michelle, called Book Crush, about my favorite children's books. So
also in the library. Okay, that it kind of reminds me too of what Miss Whitehead did for you, you know, challenging you to read beyond your horse and book favorite or horse and dog favorites. It kind of reminds me what you kind of encouraged us to do as librarians, to kind of expand the horizon of the reader.
Right.
So I still remember that too.
Yeah.
And like, you know, taking their tastes and, you know, supplying them with that, but also gently nudging them a little further, maybe.
Right. Yeah. And Whitehead certainly did that. Yeah.
Cheryl Lynch, she says you didn't interview Susan Orlean, but she wrote a very nice foreword.
Yes. So Susan Orlean was one of the writers that we wanted to include in the book, but Susan Orlean has a very peripatetic life. And she lives both in California and New York. And when we were in California, she was in New York, and in New York, we were in, California. Doing the interviews. And so when it became clear that we weren't going to be able to interview her, we asked her if she would be willing to write an introduction. And she just wrote a beautiful, beautiful introduction that I know several people have said when they read it, they just wept. That's how we felt. She's a wonderful writer. Yeah, she's a fabulous writer.
Let's see. Next is, not a question, just a huge thank you. I have read a few books every week since March in this pandemic. This is from Sherry Mudd. The Writer's Library is my absolute favorite book of the year. One of my book clubs will be reading together in December. Thank you for many new reading suggestions and reminders of some of my old favorites.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you.
Jessica Hogan asks, what was the most interesting house you visited?
Well, I think there were a couple of them. One was in California, which was T.C. Boyle's house, Tom Boyle's house, which I've talked about. Amor Towles' house in New York, Gramercy Park, is just pretty amazing and absolutely wonderful. And we did the interview in his study, which is kind of an ideal, the kind of dream of a writer's study where, he collects first editions and, there's bookcases all over. And he's another person, Amor Towles, was so generous with his time, and reading his interview, you just see that he's the kind of man who, he's the kind of writer who could write a beautiful book like A Gentleman in Moscow. And I left that interview. There were some interviews that I just left like in a daze almost, because the writers were so, they're just brilliant. And Amor Towles was one of them, a writer who's much less well known, but everybody should read her, is Siri Hustvedt. And when I left that interview, my head was just whirling with everything that we had talked about.
Let's see. Sasha asks, would you seek another partner for other age groups or genres? Kind of like the collaboration Ibram X. Kendi did with Jason Reynolds to make his work more accessible for YA. I have these chicken soup for the ... dreams, but for the Writer's Library.
Yeah. I think I just need to wait before I do anything until things settle down in some way. I mean, I feel like we've all put our life on hold in a way till the vaccine is widely available.
Yeah,
Feels
I
like
mean, I kind of hesitated to ask you about the potential sequel too, because I was wondering if you just like to kind of bask in the, the accomplishment of the book and not think, oh, what's next? What's next? Like just to enjoy it or.
Right. I think, one of the things I was struck by in talking to these writers is that they don't seem to worry about their next novel, that they finish one novel and then they go on and do another one. And I think that I think you're right, Michelle. I mean, at this point I feel like I need to just step back for a minute and figure out things.
We're at 3:45. Do you have time for?
Sure.
There's 3 more in the queue.
Yeah.
Oh no, there's just 2 that are questions. Cheryl Lynch is just you're such an inspiration to librarians. So thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Andrew Wertheimer is saying, I heard she taught twice at UW's iSchool. Is she still interested in teaching? I think her passion would be great at the UH-LIS program as adjunct faculty once we can hire again.
Yeah, I taught it at the iSchool for many years. The 2 classes, genre, sort of a genre, deconstructing genre, and then basic reader's advisory, adult reading for public librarians or whatever we called it. And yeah, I would love to do it. I think that, yeah, yes, Andrew, yes, I would love it.
Yeah, Nancy's classes were a gift. So I hope that more students get to experience that. And then the last one is Cynthia, not a question. Oh, again, but I wanted to say hello to Nancy. She came to Las Vegas for the launch of our very first adult reading program, Reading Las Vegas, and I had the pleasure of taking her around to all the trainings and programs she did for public and staff. I'm now living in Kaunakakai, Molokai. She can come visit anytime.
Oh, Cynthia, thank you. That was so much fun. That was so much fun going to Las Vegas for that and doing those. I love to do those workshops. And yes, I love libraries. Libraries are what makes a humane citizenry, and they're very important to me, and I know very important to everyone who's here. So
well, thank you very much. Let me see. I think I have to say something. Well, so thank you again for talking about your book, The Writer's Library. If audience members, if you'd like to borrow any of her books, please visit librarieshawaii.org to place a request, or you can call your local library. And if you'd like to learn more about Nancy's work, her website is nancypearl.com. So just her name.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon for our next author talk. You can view recordings of past programs on our website under virtual programs, and please look out for future ones, which will be announced on our website. So thank you again, Nancy. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. So nice to see you again too. Bye-bye.
Bye.